myself. I'm Jeff Semler. I'm a colleague of Susan's, County Extension Agent here in Washington County, Maryland. Susan is actually in Jamaica, a place that our speaker knows a little bit about. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Dahlia O'Brien. Dahlia is the Extension Specialist for Small Ruminants in Virginia State University. Time when she was in Delaware State, she was the extension specialist there, and that's where I got to know her the best, or know her first, I guess, not the best. But anyway, she was she received her PhD from the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Like I said, prior to that, she was at Virginia State, served as associate professor. Small ruminant specialist at Delaware State before going to Virginia State. In her position at Delaware State, Dr. O'Brien conducted research on a number of projects, including the characterization of Anthelmintic Resistance in gastrointestinal nematodes of small ruminants. Read here, the barber pole worm. She's evaluated natural and alternative dewormers like pumpkin seed, ginger, garlic, papaya seed, diversity of herbal wormers, as well to determine their efficacy, browsing goats that are using biological control for invasive weeds. Dr. O'Brien at Virginia State is working collaboratively, providing needs-based educational workshops and applied research for small ruminant producers locally and regionally. Interest lies in low-input small ruminant production, natural and novel means of parasite control, and assisting producers to determine on-farm parasite resistance to chemical drugs. In addition, Dahlia and her lab are responsible for counting all our worm eggs and finding out what kind of worms we have at the Western Maryland Research and Education Center at our Western Maryland goat test, or I guess we actually call it the Western Maryland Performance goat test. It sure is good to have Dahlia with us this evening. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dahlia.
Thank you, Jeff. So tonight I'll be talking about natural parasite control in small ruminants. Most of us in the industry consider internal parasite management to be one of the biggest production concerns that we have. And this is mainly associated to the treatment cost, reduced productivity, and even death related to worm infections. Traditionally, we have controlled internal parasites in sheep and goats with chemical dewormers. However, as I'm sure you've heard time and time again, the overuse and misuse of available chemical dewormers has led to these worms developing resistance to the chemicals that are available. So the topics that I'll be covering tonight will be just briefly going over anthelmintic resistance and its status in the U.S., talk about some natural parasite control strategies, including pasture and grazing management, genetic selection, nutrition, herbal dewormers, including garlic, ginger, pumpkin seeds, papaya, work that has been done with copper oxide wire particles. I'll be briefly covering condensed tannins, since I believe the speaker 2 weeks ago went over this topic in depth, and I'll mention some others. Finally, I'll just share with you some points that I think are important for you to take away from this presentation. So what is anthelmintic resistance? Anthelmintic resistance is the ability of worms in a population to survive drug treatment of the animal at the standard prescribed dosage. When do you suspect that you have anthelmintic resistance? Well, this is when animals that show any clinical symptoms are dewormed and they don't respond to treatment. That's one of the easiest ways to tell that you might have some kind of resistance problem on your farm. Research has demonstrated that worms have developed resistance to all classes of available dewormers. And this has not happened only in the US, but it's a worldwide issue. Due to this issue, in other parts of the world, new classes of dewormers have been developed. They're not available to us yet in the US, but resistance has already been reported to these new classes, even though they've only been on the market for less than about 5 years. One of those new classes, Zolvix, is expected to be approved for use in maybe in cattle and maybe sheep sometime in the near future. But as I mentioned before, there are already reports in Australia and I believe New Zealand that there is resistance to this drug already. So resistance appears to be inevitable. And this is why it's important to learn about more natural or sustainable parasite management practices and to use these in conjunction with more targeted strategic chemical dewormings to prolong the efficacy of the dewormers that still work on our farms today. So the next slide that I have up actually looks at the anthelmintic resistance status in the US. This data is actually greater than 7 years old. The Mid-Atlantic study was conducted 2008 to 2009, and the study that was conducted in the South was conducted around 2007, 2008. So this data is really not current, but it's the last scientific data that we have on the resistance status in the US. If we take a look at benzimidazole resistance, and those include your white drenches such as Valbazen, Safeguard, and Panacure, you'll see that when tested in the Mid-Atlantic area, all 33 farms tested had worms that were resistant to that class of dewormer. In the southern states, 98% were resistant. Looking at ivermectin, 82% of the farms tested had resistance to ivermectin. In the south, 76%. Cydectin was a lot lower, 47% of farms tested in the Mid-Atlantic, with 24% of farms tested in the southern states. Levamisole, and these include like your Tramisol prohibit, 24% of farms tested in the Mid-Atlantic region had resistance to levamisole, while 54% of the farms in the southern region had resistance. If this trend is continuing, then most farms currently use cydectin and or levamisole in their treatment protocol. My understanding currently is that there are more and more farms reporting multi-drug resistance with total anthelmintic failure evident on some farms in the US currently. And in these studies too, Haemonchus contortus or the barber pole worm was the prevalent internal parasite. So there are a number of natural strategies that one can use to aid in controlling infections of internal parasites. What I have observed is that producers that use natural or herbal dewormers, they have successfully incorporated this with other management practices and they take into consideration the parasite life cycle, the grazing preference of sheep versus goats, and other factors, and that is why they've been successful. And it's difficult to determine on these farms if the herbal or natural dewormer is actually causing an effect, um, or if it's a combined effect of those other management practices along with the herbal dewormer. Some of these management practices include better pasture management. And most producers should be using pasture management as a primary tool for parasite control on their farms. As I mentioned before, it's important to know the life cycle of internal parasites. And again, most of you are probably familiar with this, but essentially adult worms in the animal, the sheep or goat, they're going to pass eggs into the intestine. These eggs are going to be passed out onto pasture in the feces when conditions are right, when you have moisture and warmth. These eggs are going to go through developmental stages, larval development. These eggs are going to hatch and go through different um, larval development stages. When they get to an infective L3 stage, they will gain the ability to migrate onto blades of grass, and then they can then be eaten by the animal, and the cycle continues. Very few, we now know that very few of these worm larvae get higher than 2 inches from the ground on a plant. Some get to about 4 to 8 inches, but most of them stay below this on a plant. So trying to prevent animals from grazing below this point will help to reduce the number of worm larvae that are ingested by the animals on that pasture. We also know that larvae migrate approximately 12 inches from their manure pile. So if we could provide areas where animals can browse and eat away from the manure, then this will also reduce the number of worm larvae that are being ingested. We've also been told that reducing the stocking rate, the number of animals that are grazing on a specific amount of that pasture, that will also reduce the amount of parasite eggs that are being passed onto that pasture and reduce the number of larvae that will be ingested. So grazing sheep or goats with other species such as cattle or horses in a rotation can also aid in reducing internal parasites. We know that internal parasites of sheep and goats are different from those that affect other species such as cattle and horses, and these species actually vacuum the parasites of sheep and goats and help to clean the pasture, reducing the amount of larvae that are picked up by grazing animals. When this is something that's incorporated into your pasture management, you should always lead with more susceptible species or classes. That is, you'd want to lead with sheep or goats before cattle. And if you're doing rotation within a species, then you might want to lead, you should lead with lambs before you put ewes on there. Um, it's important to remember too, when we talk about multi-species grazing, sheep and goats are different species, but we're not talking about them because they have the same parasites. It has to be another species that has different parasites. There has been research that shows that calves are susceptible to Haemoncus contortus infection. They do tend to get diarrhea from it, so if you want to incorporate this into your pasture control regimen, then you would want to use mature cattle. In addition to multi-species grazing, providing access to browse and bioactive forages, especially those that have been shown to control parasite infections, including Sericea lespedeza and chicory. Dr. Whitley gave a great talk, I think about 2 weeks ago, and all the uses of Sericea lespedeza, including its antiparasitic benefits. So if you weren't a part of that webinar, I would suggest going to Susan's website and maybe viewing that one. It is also important to provide clean pastures for your young and other susceptible stock. Rotating pastures is another key principle in reducing infections with internal parasites. You really don't want to keep animals on the same pasture for multiple parasite life cycles, as this increases their chances of picking up larvae and becoming um, infected. So it should be considered in any kind of pasture management. It's very important. It's an important factor in limiting pasture infections. When you consider how often you should rotate a pasture under optimum conditions, and we're talking about warmth and moisture, the barber pole worm, for instance, they'll complete their life cycle in about 21 days. It can be shorter in some cases. And when an animal is moved to a pasture, on day one, if it has any mature worms, they will already be shedding eggs. And it takes about 4 to 5 days for these eggs to hatch and get to that infective larval stage. So research at Oklahoma, I think it was Langston University, showed that 5 days was enough to avoid parasitism during the height of the parasite season. The next question in a pasture rotation system would be, when is it safe to return animals to a pasture? This is going to depend on a number of factors. It's going to depend on your worm species, temperature, moisture, forage type, the individual animal immune status. But again, research in Oklahoma has shown that when the barber pole worm predominates, rest in pastures for 60 days has shown good results. They've demonstrated that these pastures go from high parasite contamination to low parasite contamination. So in addition for resting it for 60 days, maybe what you could combine this pasture rotation with too is to include, if you have other species, is to bring the cattle after, bring, for example, bring cattle after sheep and goats, and this will help to reduce the pasture contamination as well. There's some of us in here. I know Susan Shane is a big advocate for genetic selection, as most of you are aware. But there are several breeds of sheep and goats that are considered to be resistant to parasites. And resistance is simply the ability of that host or animal to limit infection, and it's typically assessed by fecal egg counts. There are certain breeds that have been shown through research to possess this natural resistance, and these include like your Gulf Coast native, St. Croix, Barbados, black belly. It's not limited to these sheep breeds, of course. You can find research conducted with other breeds. For instance, the Texel breed has been shown to have some resistance to parasites. Goat breeds include Goat breeds that are resistant to parasites include Spanish, Kiko, and myotonic breeds, and some of this research was conducted at Tennessee State University by Richard Browning, and they did show that the Spanish and the Kiko, especially when compared to Boer goats, are pretty resistant to parasites. It's important to remember when you're thinking about resistance that it varies among individuals within breeds as well. I mentioned the Boer breed before, and even though Boers aren't noted for their parasite-resistant traits, you can still find individuals within any breed that will be more resistant to parasites, and these are the ones that we should be selecting for in our flock or in our herd. Um, I'm not sure if many of you have heard about the 70-30 or 80-20 rule as it pertains to internal parasites, but this simply states that 20 to 30% of your flock will shed 70 to 80% of the parasite's eggs onto your pasture, leading to contamination. So if you are using a tool such as FAMACHA and you're doing strategic deworming, then you should cull any animal that is susceptible to parasites. And these will be your animals that always have a high FAMACHA score and are the ones that you constantly have to be deworming. By culling these susceptible animals, you're increasing your flock resistance and reducing pasture contamination and decreasing your deworming frequency. that reduction in pasture contamination is especially important for your more susceptible animals, such as your young animals that you might put on those pastures. And when if there's an animal that you determine by FAMACHA that constantly needs deworming, then the offspring from these types of animals aren't offsprings that you want to be keeping in your herd, because resistance is a heritable trait, and you'd be selecting for that high fecal count in your herd as well. So these animals aren't what you want to be selecting for. You want to cull them, and by culling those parasite susceptible animals, you will increase flock resistance. So there's some animals that might not be resistant, but they might be resilient, and this simply means that they have the ability to withstand an infection. Um, the question becomes, is this an animal that I want to keep in my herd? And your answer should be no. Resilience is assessed by FAMACHA and hematocrits. And FAMACHA and hematocrits, they simply measure the degree of anemia, and anemia can be indicative of barber pole worm infection, because they're a blood-sucking parasite, and one of the symptoms of high infection is anemia. What these resilient animals tend to do is they always have high fecal egg count, yet they demonstrate few, if any, signs of parasitism. So they have good FAMACHA scores, decent to good FAMACHA scores. They would have good body condition scores as well, but if you take a fecal egg count, it's pretty high. So even though someone might think this is something I want to keep in my herd, these resilient animals are contributing a lot of eggs and larvae to your pastures. And, um, and that's not good for any other susceptible animals that you might have in your herd. It is also important too to remember rams and bucks. A lot of times we think about selection, and and sometimes we forget about rams and bucks when it comes to parasite resistance, but it's important, and it should be you should use that in your selection of any replacement ram or buck, or any that you're gonna purchase again, because they contribute 50% of that genetics to any subsequent offspring, and you would want to choose animals that are resistant. So I'm gonna help Susan out by saying that if you want a parasite resistant buck, then you should possibly be looking at the bucks that are coming out of her buck performance test, because they have been rigorously tested, and fecal egg counts and FAMACHA scores have been checked on those animals, and so the animals that are in the top at the end of that test are pretty resistant to parasites. So those are animals that you should be looking to get into your flock or your herd. Lastly, before we go into the natural dewormers, I just want to emphasize that good nutrition supports the immune system and makes animals more tolerant of internal parasites and possibly be more resistant. If you think about it, in any living thing, if you provide adequate nutrients, then the health and productivity will be better. Um, this is because if you provide higher levels of protein aids in rebuilding tissue damaged by worms, and minerals such as copper and zinc support a good immune system in these animals. Looking at research conducted on the benefits of protein supplementation, we've seen where ewes receiving higher levels of protein for 6 weeks prior to lambing have significantly lower fecal egg counts compared to those that were not supplemented. And this is important in this last stage of gestation due to the periparturient rise in fecal egg counts. How much protein is going to depend on the specific condition, what forage, and also the production class of that animal. When research has also been conducted looking at supplementing lambs, and it's consistently shown that supplementing lambs increases gains and increases hematocrits. Again, hematocrits measure anemia, which might be indicative of the barber pole worm, and that is why we do FOMACHA scores. So higher hematocrits or higher FOMACHA scores are desirable, and they indicate less of a parasite problem. Legumes also provide more protein, so Axis can help to protect your animals from internal parasites. In talking about the nutritional management, sheep and goats that are raised in confinement or in a dry lot will also have less parasite issues because they're not constantly picking up larvae off the pasture. Everything I've discussed so far is utilizing the life cycle of the parasite, pastures, host characteristics, and nutrition, which are natural sustainable components in a parasite management regime. Next, I'm going to discuss some alternate dewormers and what we know about how effective they are in reducing fecal head counts or basically in controlling parasite in infections. And when I talk about alternative or natural, it simply means that these are substances used to control worms other than the drugs that are commercially available. As Jeff stated in the beginning, I've conducted some research projects on the efficacy of garlic, papaya, pumpkin, and ginger as natural dewormers, and I'll be presenting these during the course of this presentation. Other natural plant products include wormwood and fennel, in addition to the individual herbs or plant products that can be used. There are various herbal wormers that are available on the market, and they're just combinations of different plant products, and some of these state on there that they're effective in controlling internal parasites in small ruminants. So we'll just go through some of the research that has been done using these products to see if they're in fact effective or not. But I can tell you before we get into this that a lot of the information available is anecdotal or hearsay mostly, and there's been limited research conducted to provide verification, and even when you can find research that supports anthelmintic properties of individual herbs or natural plant products, then they're inconsistent. So this study was this study that I'm going to describe next was actually a producer study, but a lot of interest in these natural dewormers came about from producers reporting that I use garlic in my animals. I feed them some garlic, and I never have to deworm, or I drench them with some garlic juice and I never have to deworm. And because of anthelmintic resistance and because the increased interest by producers in a lot of these natural dewormers, some researchers came together and decided to, let's see if we can repeat these results in control experiments. And one of these producer farms, um, and this project was actually funded by a Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education grant, but they looked at 1 teaspoon of garlic juice. It was diluted with water to provide about a 1 ounce dose to see if it would be effective against worms. This this producer was interested in garlic because she was an organic farmer, and so fecal samples were measured every 2 to 3 weeks, beginning in May and ending in September, and she had four treatment groups, a control that received no treatment at all, the garlic treatment, and then she had two commercial herbal dewormers that she tested with this. She dosed them monthly starting around June 6th. It is believed that the active ingredient in garlic is allicin, and we know that it has antimicrobial properties, and we also know that it helps to boost the immune system. And what this producer reported, and I know it's difficult for you to see, this graph isn't so clear, but essentially what it reported was over that parasite season, that the animals that were in the garlic group tended to have a lower fecal count compared to the other treatments that were used in the study, as well as to the control. The study, if you look on top of the graph, it says Haemonchus contortus over time, but this graph, and it's looking at Haemonchus, it claims to be looking at Haemonchus contortus eggs over time, but there's actually no way to speciate parasites by doing a fecal egg count. All the eggs, if you've ever done a fecal egg count, the eggs that you're looking at, they're oval shaped, and they look alike. And it's hard to differentiate Haemonchus contortus from Trichostrongylus or some other species of parasite. In order to do that, you would have to do a larval identification in the lab, and there are experts that do this, and we do this for the Western Maryland production test, as Jeff mentioned before. But essentially, she found that if she gave that diluted 1 teaspoon of garlic juice, it kept the fecal counts lower than compared to the other treatments. These animals all had unlimited access to, grain, hay, and they were also given a free choice access to minerals containing, and they had diatomaceous earth in it as well. If we look at controlled experiments conducted in Arkansas looking at the efficacy of garlic in reducing fecal egg counts in both kids and in lambs, we'll see that this study showed no reduction in fecal egg count of giving 1.7 ounce of garlic juice, and that was using, again, the garlic barrier product, or even using 1.4 ounce of freshly squeezed garlic juice, or 2 to 3 bulbs of garlic, which was equivalent to that amount of juice. There was no effect at all of garlic on reduction of fecal egg counts. An additional experiment was conducted looking at papaya seeds in reducing fecal egg counts, and this study also demonstrated that it had no effectiveness. It had no effect on fecal egg counts in lambs. Another study looking at papayas in meat goat kids, and these animals were given 0.1 ounce per pound of body weight. They were treated every other day for 21 days. This showed that, again, if you look at the fecal egg counts of the papaya group compared to the control group, fecal egg counts are basically similar. There was no benefit of giving the papaya seeds to these meat goat kids. And most of these animals that we're going to be talking about, they were susceptible animals, so they were about 4 to 5 months old. When we think about papaya, the active ingredient is thought to be cysteine proteinases that's in the papaya latex itself. And I have come across a study in sheep that were artificially inoculated with a barber pole worm, where fecal egg counts were reduced by 98%. However, in these controlled experiments conducted, one was conducted in Arkansas, the other in Maryland, there was no effect of garlic or papaya on fecal egg counts. This set of pumpkin seed trials that I'll be discussing next were conducted in my laboratory, again as part of a SEER grant. We decided to test pumpkin seeds because of anecdotal evidence that it has some anthelmintic property, and one scientific article had found online that showed that pumpkin seeds reduce fecal egg count in merino lambs by 65.5%. So due to this, I decided to test some pumpkin seeds and see if they offered any anthelmintic properties. Um, so meat goats were fed, and these were about 5-month-old meat goat kids. They were fed pumpkin seeds top dressed on their feed, and it was fed at about 0.08 ounces per pound or not every day for 21 days. And if you look at the graph again, we basically found that there was no reduction in fecal egg counts due to the pumpkin seeds, and 2 animals actually had to be removed from the pumpkin group due to high fecal egg counts and the demonstration of clinical symptoms. The active ingredient in pumpkin seeds is believed to be cucurbitacin. But what we did notice in this study is that goats, goats they love to sort through feed. And the goats in this study would sort through the feed, and they weren't consuming, they might not have been consuming that dosage of pumpkin seed that we were offering. And when we looked at the body weights and the amount of feed consumed over the study trial, this was reduced in the pumpkin group compared to the control group in the study. So based on the results from this first study, we decided that we had to find a way to make sure that these goats were consuming the pumpkin seeds. Um, so I found a recipe online for a pumpkin seed drench, and I decided to try that. It can be a pretty I don't want to say labor intensive procedure to go through making this drench, but it takes a lot of time. It's not it doesn't take a lot of work, but it takes a lot of time to make this drench. And if you are interested in it, I believe the recipe is mentioned in an article by Duval in traditional treatments for parasites, or traditional natural treatments for parasites. And if you Google that, you should be able to find it. I don't have the exact website now. But anyway, we decided to test meat goat kids and treat them with a pumpkin seed drench. Um, the amount of pumpkin seeds that we used was similar to what was used in the previous study. And we also decided to add ginger to this as well. I'm not sure what the active ingredient is in the ginger. I don't think we know what that is. But these goats either received a pumpkin seed drench, a ginger drench, or no treatment every other day over a 42-day period. Um, what I can tell you from the results of this study is that even though there was no statistical effect of treatment on the fecal egg counts, that is, none of these treatments reduced fecal egg counts compared to the control. I did notice that we had to deworm and remove more animals from the control and ginger group than we had from the pumpkin seed drench group. And these were animals that had similar fecal egg counts, but for some reason they weren't showing the clinical symptoms. We were measuring hematocrit on a weekly basis, and for for some reason the animals that received the pumpkin seed drench just weren't exhibiting any of the clinical symptoms. They weren't becoming anemic due to the high fecal egg counts. And we did find when we slaughtered these animals and did abomasal worm counts that the control animals had significantly more worms in their abomasum compared to both the ginger and the pumpkin seed groups. Moving on to commercial dewormers that are available, or rather that have been studied in research, these dewormers are a combination of multiple products. And for instance, the Hager's Herbal Wormer that contains wormwood, gentian, fennel, psyllium, and quassia, and it's available. And a lot of times you will go to their website and it might not be in stock because it's a pretty popular herbal dewormer. Another one that used to be available, I'm not sure it's available still, Molly's Herbal Worm Formula. It contains wormwood, black walnut, and other natural um, products, and that's one that has been tested, and there's a publication out on that. But whether you're using individual plant or herbal wormers, or you're using a combination in some of these herbal products, they are attractive to many producers. For one, they're natural, there are no environmental hazards, and there's no need for a withdrawal period. So they're very attractive to producers. However, the question again becomes, do they work? Are they effective in reducing fecal egg counts in sheep and goats? Um, Hager's herbal wormer has been tested in a control study, and the results from this indicated that there was no reduction in fecal egg counts in meat goat kids that were tested. These animals had greater than 50% Haemoncus, so Haemoncus was the predominant parasite in these studies, and the recommended dose of the manufacturer was followed in deworming these goat kids. However, as you can see, there was no benefit of the Hager's Herbal Wormer over this 35-day period in meat goat kids. And these kids were actually kept in individual pens on concrete, so there was no chance of reinfection. A second study was conducted looking at um, Hager's Herbal Wormer in lactating meat does, and these animals were again um, they were treated at the manufacturer's recommended dose or not over a 70-day period. The predominant parasite was Haemoncus contortus, and they were naturally infected. What we did notice in this group is that the fecal egg counts increased by 535% in the control group and only by 182% in that herbal dewormer group by the end of the study. Um, this might indicate to some extent that, but we can't really say that Hager could possibly have, if this dewormer could possibly have some effect against worms if the animals are being reinfected on pasture as opposed to being in pens on a concrete floor where reinfection is not possible. And this experiment was also conducted for 70 days, and maybe it should have been conducted for longer to see to see any effects. The reason why it's hard to make any conclusions from this study is because there were only 8 animals per treatment used in this study, and in order to make those specific conclusions, you need more animals and maybe test it for a longer period of time. We also noticed that we also recorded that there were 8 total dewormers during those 7 days. 6 animals out of the control group had to be dewormed, while only 2 in that herbal dewormer group had to be dewormed. But again, I want to stress that we have to be cautious in making any direct conclusions for this due to the limited amount of animals in this study. Ideally, we would like to have this study repeated in more animals, and then if animals do need deworming, they could be removed from the study and not left in the study because of those low numbers. So if you look over some of those bars, you'll see an asterisk and a number, and those actually indicate the amount of animals that were dewormed on that specific day. Another commercial herbal dewormer that has been studied is Molly's Herbal Worm Formula. And this study basically showed that even though there were minor improvements in FOMACHA scores, there were no reduction in worm counts observed. So again, this is another study that shows that there was no reduction in fecal egg counts due to a herbal dewormer. So when it comes to herbal dewormers, What we do know is that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that they do work. If you look on a lot of websites or listservs, you will find many testimonials from producers that say, they use various plant products, various herbs, and they work for them. They reduce deworming, and you can actually find some producers that say they never have to deworm their animals because they use a particular product. However, there is lack of scientific support, and when support is available, inconsistent results are reported. And why is this occurring? Why do we see so much inconsistent data? This is mainly because the active ingredients vary. Um, and also the the active ingredients vary, and common names do not always refer to the same plant. And an important factor is those recommended might not be high enough to produce anthelmintic properties. But if a specific, if, say for instance, pumpkin seed, if you need a specific amount of that active ingredient, if that's what has for it to have or demonstrate an anthelmintic properties, how can we be sure that that 500 grams of pumpkin seeds from one variety has the same amount of that active ingredient as another pumpkin variety found in the same place or somewhere else? Um, these research have not been consistent in testing similar amounts of, of product, and even if they have tested similar amount of product, there hasn't been any verification of the actual amount of active ingredients in these products. So they vary, and we believe that that's why there's so much inconsistency with the data that's available out there. In order for us to be confident and say that a herbal product works, then this herbal product would have to be tested across a number would have to be tested across a number of in both species, for one, in sheep and goats, in different classes, so young animals versus mature animals, and also in different locations. And there's just not too much consistency in a lot of these herbal dewormers in the studies that are conducted to be able to say for sure that they work. And we also have to be cautious because some herbs can be toxic to animals. So I won't recommend to any producer to use a herbal product or not. What I will say is that they should always be combined with other integrated parasite management techniques. And it is important to know the status of drug resistance on your farm so that these techniques can be used in conjunction with an effective chemical dewormer. Okay, so moving on to some products now that such as copper oxide wire particle, that there's been a significant amount of research done and data available that this product, there's overwhelming evidence that it reduces fecal egg counts in both sheep and goats. Um, Copper oxide wire particles are available commercially to alleviate copper deficiency in ruminant livestock, and it was used in areas where copper levels in the forages were insufficient, and so these animals would have copper deficiency. Copper is very important for immune function, and so a deficiency, you do not want to have this deficient in your animals, and that's why copper oxide wire particles were developed. Before we go any further into data that's been found on the efficacy of copper oxide wire particles in reducing fecal egg counts, I just want to um, to say that sheep are extremely sensitive to copper. The margin of safety between required amount of copper and the toxic level is extremely narrow, so caution. So you should be cautious when using any kind of copper product in your herd or flock, and it's best to at least to know your copper status on your farm before you start using any copper products. There are some sheep breeds that are more sensitive to copper than others, and goats tend to be less susceptible and can tolerate up to about 3.5 times the amount of copper than sheep can um, can tolerate. The form of copper that's used in copper oxide wire particle is poorly observed when compared to copper sulfate, and so this reduces the risk of copper toxicity in animals. But as I stated previously, there have been multiple studies conducted showing that copper oxide wire particles, and the studies conducted looked at the that produced by the copper shore, um, and in these studies, copper oxide wire particles were found to be effective against Haemonchus contortus, or the barber pole worm. All the data indicate that it's effective against this worm, and it's not as effective against the other parasites. The mode of action is still sort of unknown. It's believed that it changes the abomasal environment to some extent, that such that the barber pole worm cannot survive in it. Um, and it can also cause direct physical damage to the larvae, making it not viable. And this has been seen in one study that did electron microscopy looking at the larvae. They saw that there was physical damage to the larvae from animals that were treated with copper oxide wire particles. Um, Again, copper oxide wire particles has been tested in both sheep and goats. It's been tested at multiple locations. It's been tested in young animals versus old animals, and has been found to be effective in reducing fecal egg counts, and therefore we can be more confident in recommending that it be included in an integrated parasite control program specifically to control Haemonchus contortus on farms. Some considerations with copper oxide wire particle use. Um, it's recommended to use the smallest dose needed to achieve the desired effect in young animals. Use 0.5 to 1 gram per head, zero point 0.5 gram preferable. In older mature animals, 2 to 4 grams have been studied, but in sheep and in smaller goat breeds, you can use lower doses. Depending on the dose, you do not want to administer copper oxide wire particles any more than for 2 to 4 treatments in any one grazing season, and at least 6 weeks should elapse between treatments. And these recommendations come from studies that were looking at animals that were given the lowest dose of copper oxide wire particles at 6-week intervals over the height of the parasite season, so that would be over summer. Liver copper concentrations were measured, and they were within the normal range for all animals. However, those that were treated with the copper oxide wire particles were a bit higher than those of the control animals, but they were still within the normal range. So this is why we say it's important to find out the copper status on your individual farm before trying to use copper oxide wire particle in your animals, because you do not want to deal with copper toxicity issues, especially in your sheep. I won't go into condensed tannins too much, because there was a very good webinar. I said 2 weeks ago, I think Dr. Whitley did this webinar, and it is available at the Sheep and Goat webinar website if you'd want to view that presentation, and a lot of important information on its multiple uses, how to grow Sericea lespedeza, and the results from all the research that have shown that it's effective. It's been scientifically proven to reduce parasite loads in sheep and goats. Tannins are plant compounds that bind to proteins and other molecules. So plants such as Sericea lespedeza and chicory that have a high condensed tannin, um, have high condensed tannin, they these are the ones that have been studied and shown to reduce parasite loads. Specifically, in most of the research that's been done, it's the AU Grazer variety of Sericea lespedeza that has been tested, and this is available through Sims Brothers in Alabama. But essentially, the mechanism of action is not yet known. It could be that they react directly with adult worms by attaching to their skin, causing some distress, or indirectly by improving protein nutrition of the goat and boosting the immune system. And what it does, it binds to protein and increase bypass proteins, causing the animals to basically use proteins more efficiently. When tested fresh or dried, and this is grazed, or looking at hay, leaf meal, pellets, or even preserved forms of Sericea lespedeza, have been shown to have some level of antiparasitic activity against worms, in particular Haemonchus contortus, and researchers have also shown that it's effective against the protozoan parasite that causes coccidiosis in sheep and goats. As I said before, much more information is available on that presentation that was given 2 weeks ago, but you could also visit the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control for more information on Sericea lespedeza, or contact Tom Terrell at Fort Valley State University for additional information on Sericea lespedeza. In addition to Sericea, forage chicory has also been evaluated for its efficacy in reducing fecal egg counts. And it has been studied in lambs, and it has shown that it can animals that graze chicory have consistently less fecal egg counts and grew faster than lambs that are grazing other forages. Therefore, plants containing condensed tannins, these the chicory and the Sericea lespedeza, um, they appear to be very good choices for use in an integrated parasite control system. In terms of Sericea lespedeza, there are specific concerns with how long you graze your young animals. I think current recommendations are that you graze for less than 8 weeks, as it starts having some effect on trace minerals in these animals. There's some other natural products that I want to mention really quick. One is diatomaceous earth, also known as diatomite, and these are just the skeletal remains of single-cell algae, and there are claims that they can serve as effective alternative dewormer for animals. Again, just like herbal dewormers, I come across many producers who include DE, in their parasite control regimen. DE is composed primarily of hydrated silica, with about 10 to 16% of other minerals depending on the source. But it's been used for many years for control of various pests, but as a deworming control, um, there there has been inconsistent results. And again, it goes to those anecdotal claims, there are producers that say it extends the time between dewormings, or it kills worms in goats at 2% in the feed. They will kill internal parasites, and there's some that claim that it's effective against specific parasites. However, scientific data have shown that while diatomaceous earth has insecticidal properties, the majority of control studies in sheep, goats, and cattle show no significant impact on fecal egg counts. Again, as with most other products discussed, I will not say to use or not use DE. If you believe that incorporating into your feed or in your parasite control regimen somehow works on your farm, then there's nothing wrong with that. However, there's lack of scientific data that shows that, but DE does contain trace minerals that might provide a boost in immunity, even though there's no scientific data that shows this. So it could be providing enough of a boost in immunity to be doing something. Um, Another natural product that has been studied in cattle, sheep, and goats is nematode trapping fungi, specifically Diatomaceous flagrans. This is a nematode trapping fungus that essentially survives passage through the digestive tract of livestock. It germinates and spreads on fresh feces, producing specialized nematode trapping structures that restrict the development of parasite larvae. Last I heard, this is not available in the US currently. There have been multiple studies looking at deflagrants, and these studies have shown that there is an effect against internal parasites. Um, if you're gonna, when incorporating it into a parasite control regime, it's more about reducing the number of infective larvae that's on the pasture. So it does nothing to adult worms inside the animals, but it reduces the number of infective larvae on the pasture, thereby reducing the parasite, um, therefore reducing the number of larvae that are ingested by the animal and producing less parasite infections. Previously, this product was not, it was hard to make it commercially available because studies used up to 1 million spores per kilogram body weight in the different livestock species, but Australia has developed a new a strain of this fungi that provides control at a dose of 30,000 spores per kilogram body weight, making it more commercial, and it's expected that in Australia it will be available soon as a feed additive, and but I have no idea if this will be available in the US anytime soon. Even though I just wanted to mention a vaccine as well because even though this is not natural, I thought that might be of interest to some producers that there is work being done on vaccines specifically to control the barber pole worm, and there's one such vaccine that has been developed. It's known as Barbivax, and it's available in other countries, not the U.S. It offers protection, as I said before, against the barber pole worm, and essentially it's four to five subcutaneous injections of these vaccine in lambs. It's approved for use in lambs only at intervals of about 6 weeks for these animals to build immunity to barber pole. But it does not replace the need for deworming because it's a vaccine against the barber pole worm. And when there are other species of parasites that are present, then you'd still have to deworm for these. It might never be available in the US because it's costly to make. Supply is very limited even though the demand is high. It takes a lot of animals to generate the antibodies for these vaccines. And it's believed that we might not have enough sheep in the US, or the sheep industry might not be large enough to warrant the work into these vaccines. There are other vaccines that are being investigated, but not sure if they'll be developed for commercialization or for the market. So what I want you to take away from this presentation is that there's strong evidence that resistance has reached critical levels throughout the entire eastern United States. Reports out of the University of Georgia, where they do most of the larval dendrite assays for determined resistance, indicate that there are more and more farms that have multi-drug resistance and even farms that have total dewormer failure. Therefore, sustainable integrated parasite management practice must become the new model or standard. Um, so we need to incorporate, it's very important to incorporate some of the natural control strategies such as pasture management, genetic selection, and so forth into any kind of parasite control regime so that we rely less on chemical dewormers. and also so that the efficacy of these dewormers, um, they could last longer if we're using them less. Looking at the scientific studies that have been done on natural products, most scientific studies found that natural products fail to reduce worm counts in sheep and goats. And even if they do show an effect, is inconsistent data, and there aren't multiple studies that actually compare the amount of active ingredients that are in these products. So herbal products should never be relied on alone for controlling or treating internal parasites. They should always be combined with other integrated parasite management techniques. Sericea lespedeza and copper oxide wire particles are two effective natural deworming products that can be incorporated into a sustainable control program for worm control in sheep and goats. And this is because, as I stated before, there is overwhelming data that shows that regardless of location, regardless of species, regardless of class, they tend to be effective. And lastly, it is important to know the status of drug resistance on your farm so that whatever techniques you're utilizing on your farm, they can be used in conjunction with a more targeted and strategic manner of deworming following the principles of smart drenching. Wow, I didn't realize I was speaking for over an hour. But thank you all for your attention, and I'll do my best to answer your questions.
Okay. Yeah, I have a question here from Alan. It has have you heard of aspen in the Populus genus group? It's used as a natural dewormer in horses. And have you heard anything being done in small ruminants?
What kind of product is it? What kind of natural product is it?
Aspen is a tree,
Oh, you said aspen. Oh,
so I'm assuming,
I
yeah,
have no information and work being done in sheep and goats with that product. Yeah.
okay. There was a question on why do all the graphs show a decline even in the control
The
groups?
graphs that you're probably referring to are probably those studies that were conducted in animals that were penned and off pasture. So these would be animals that wouldn't be getting reinfected by parasites. So you would expect that, following the natural life cycle of parasites, for instance, 21 days, you would expect that this would fall off after that time period. Did I make that clear?
There's a question. We'll see if she types back in. There's a question about Vermex, a combination herbal dewormer
Mm-hmm.
from the UK. Any experience with this
I
product?
have not tested that product, and I don't know of any other researchers in the U.S. that have tested it.
What about any information about using copper drench with copper sulfate
Using
powder
copper sulfate, um, yeah, there's
as a
been a lot
drench?
of discussion about the use of copper sulfate because there are a few producers that still use it, and there's inconsistent data that is out there, and all I can say is that copper sulfate, there's varying results. Some studies have shown it's effective, some have shown it's not. It used to be recommended for drenching previously by the USDA before chemical dewormers. However, again, one has to be careful in using copper sulfate because the copper in that product is more easily absorbed, especially in sheep where you could have toxicity issues.
Okay, are there blood tests to determine copper levels in your
There are
flock or herd?
there are
And
blood tests that can be used to measure. You can measure copper status. However, these are not so reliable. They're not very reliable. They can be misleading. I believe, because they can be normal despite having dangerously high levels, high tissue levels of copper. So the best way to determine the assess copper status is to actually measure copper in liver samples. So I know that they recommend that if you have any animals that die, yeah, a healthy animal that suddenly dies, then maybe you could get a liver sample, or if when slaughtering these animals, you could get a liver sample and get these tested for copper. But that's the best way to assess copper um, status and not blood samples because that can be misleading.
Okay, how about have you heard any data from using wild rose? Evidently, wild
Hmm.
rose contains high tannins.
I have not heard of any specific research that has used wild rose as a natural anthelmintic.
All right, and how about can you speak to the control of external parasites with the emphasis on KEDs?
Some of these um, some of these natural products that I discussed, for instance, if we talk about the garlic the or I would probably say diatomaceous earth. Some maybe those that are insecticidal as well have those properties. Then those could probably have an effect on external parasites, but I am not sure of any studies that have specifically looked at external parasite reduction and natural dewormers. But it might be an indirect, effect of it. It might be, we just don't know.
I don't see I
Okay.
don't see any more questions. So we certainly thank you. Oh, Virginia is going to type. Oh, she just says thank you. We thank you, Dahlia, for weighing in. This is the final episode in this um, series this year. Look forward to seeing you back next year. Keep an eye on your email box and keep an eye on the blog post that Susan takes care of. I'm sure there'll be some follow up to these sessions as well as other information throughout the coming uh, 6 months to a year. You can always watch our goat test. We do a lot of work with parasite resistance and resilience, mountains of data. One day we'll have Delia get a grad student to crunch all those numbers, but till then, we'll just keep taking little bits and pieces. Thank you very much, and we'll sign off from here.
All right. Thank you, everyone.